Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Jumana Qadour, and I'm the head of the Syria portfolio here at the Atlantic Council. Today, we're hosting a timely discussion entitled Regional Expansionism, Iranian Militias in the Levant, and it's focused on militias in Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. It's timely for two reasons. One, because US-Iran policy is one of the most contentious areas of foreign policy in this year's 2020 elections. And two, because a year ago today marks the anniversary of the Iraqi protest movement that has subsequently led to hundreds of killed and kidnapped. Last October also witnessed the newest wave of protests in Lebanon, both countries which we will be addressing today. Before I begin, I want to make a few general announcements. Please note that this event is public and on the record, and we invite you to follow Atlantic Council Syria work by checking our website or following us on Twitter at AC Mideast. We'll begin our event today with an introduction by and questions to Deputy Assistant Secretary Joel Rayburn. I'll then follow that up with a discussion with four experts on Iranian militias in the Levant, and then I'll open it up to questions and answers from the audience. Please submit your questions through the Q&A function and make sure to include your name and affiliation. I'd like to now introduce our keynote speaker, Deputy Assistant Secretary Joel Rayburn, who will discuss with us the current administration's policy and strategy on countering Iranian militias in the Levant. Deputy Assistant Secretary Rayburn currently serves as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Levant Affairs and Special Envoy for Syria since July 2018. Previously, he served in the administration as the Senior Director for Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon at the National Security Council. He is also a retired US Army officer who served in a variety of assignments in the Middle East, Europe, and the United States for more than 2 decades. Das Rayburn, thank you for joining us. I'd like to give you an opportunity to open up with some introductory remarks, and then I'll dive into some questions that I have for you. Welcome.
Thank you, Jumana, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for organizing this event and for giving me the opportunity to speak about what is a really important topic. The topic put to me is Iranian commanded, Iranian-backed militias in the Levant. I think really the United States approach to this problem of Iranian regime-sponsored militias is nested under our broader Iran policy. The Iran policy of the Trump administration starts out with the fundamental fact that the Islamic Republic of Iran is a theocratic, brutish regime that will not voluntarily seek peace or make life better for the Iranian people or for Iran's regional neighbors. And it's also the single largest state sponsor of terrorism in the world. I would say, pertinent to the question, is that the Iranian regime is also an aggressive military power that's aimed at establishing hegemony over its regional neighbors. And what we've been witnessing for the past decade and more is an unprecedented Iranian military intervention in 4 Arab countries: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, as well as some Iranian interference in international waterways and so on that the region and the world economy depends upon. The Iranian regime has been attempting to turn the 4 Arab countries that I mentioned into Iranian military garrisons, where the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran and its militant proxies can bring strategic weapons, establish strategic power projection platforms that can threaten the entire region, as well as international commerce and the international community's relations with the region. And I would say, and I think there's broad agreement on this inside the administration, that this is the single most destabilizing factor in the Middle East today. For many years, this Iranian regime aggression was something that the United States and other Western countries either didn't acknowledge, didn't understand, or didn't respond to. But the United States during the Trump administration has made this central to our Middle East policy and strategies, is to push back on this Iranian aggression into the surrounding region, mostly into the Arab world, but I think we also have to include Afghanistan and South Asia as well. And so during the Trump administration, we've finally taken a very active approach to this problem, working with our partners and allies in the region. We've redoubled our efforts to preserve peace and stability in the region. First and foremost, by mounting a broad pressure campaign against the Iranian regime and its clients, and particularly by imposing severe sanctions and working with our allies and partners to enforce those sanctions very strictly. This pressure campaign has weakened Hezbollah. It's diminished the money available to Iranian commanded militias inside Iraq, and it's brought the Iranian presence in Syria under greater and greater pressure. A word on Syria. Our Syria policy and our Iran policy, they're very closely connected. We have a severe, we have an increasing amount of pressure that the United States and our allies are bringing to bear on the Assad regime and its allies to try to compel them to accede to UN Security Council Resolution 2254 and an end to the conflict. But also one of the conditions that the United States has made clear to the Syrian government and its allies is that that pressure will continue also, not just until the conflict is resolved, but also until Iranian commanded forces exit Syria. At the same time, our US colleagues who work on Iran policy have made it clear to the Iranian regime and to the rest of the international community that the maximum pressure campaign on Iran, one of the objectives of that as well, and a condition that the Iranian regime will have to meet before it can get out from under that pressure, is to withdraw its forces from Syria. So in this way, you see the two policies are very closely linked, they're very closely synchronized. A word on Syria, and then maybe we can touch on Lebanon a little bit later in the questions. We've also begun to ask Syrians, both inside Syria and those who are outside Syria, and particularly those who are inside Syria who are supporters of the Syrian government, is why is it tolerable to supporters of the Syrian government that Bashar al-Assad has invited the Iranian regime in to turn Syria into a military garrison for the Iranians to use against Iran's regional neighbors? And why is it acceptable for supporters of the Syrian government that the Iranian regime should have cultural and an economic presence in Syria as well, and should be trying to persuade Syrians to become followers of Walayat al-Faqih? So we think these are things that all Syrians have an interest in seeing stopped, rolled back, pushed out of Syria, just as they should be pushed out of the other countries that the Iranian regime is intervening in. I'll stop right there. There's a lot more to be said on this, but we can do it in the form of the questions.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much, Das Rayburn. I'd like to start off with a question that's sort of, it's assumed by a lot of folks in the administration, but would be great to have clarification on. So after withdrawing from the JCPOA, the Trump administration employed the maximum pressure campaign. It's gone on for the last 3 years. Now, the claim is that this campaign has left the IRGC with less resources as a result, and that those limited resources have resulted in less malign Iranian behavior in the region. Can you talk to us about how you're making this assessment? What's the evidence that you're seeing in order to make this case?
Well, we know that the maximum pressure campaign and the sanctions that have been reimposed on the Iranian regime have denied the Iranian regime a great portion of the resources that it was using to finance its aggressive behavior in the region. Since the onset of the maximum pressure campaign, we estimate that we've denied the Iranian regime direct access to around $70 billion in oil revenues. That's since May 2018. And going forward, we expect that our oil and petrochemical sanctions will continue to deprive the regime of as much as $50 billion in revenue annually. That means that there are fewer resources to go around inside the Iranian regime for the IRGC and specifically the Quds Force to be able to spend on militant proxies in Lebanon and Iraq and Yemen. And there's a smaller, there are fewer resources for the Iranian regime to use as a subsidy to the Assad regime as well. And we've seen austerity measures essentially across all of those Iranian regime clients. Iranian proxies in Syria and elsewhere are going unpaid. The services they once relied on are drying up. We find that Shia militant fighters that the Iranian regime deploys no longer can rely on steady and consistent Iranian regime support. And Hamas has also enacted what it calls an austerity plan to deal with the loss of funding from Iran. Meanwhile, the Iranian state propaganda apparatus, for example, has taken a hit. We know that multiple Iranian state television channels have had to shut down in 2020, and we know that others are on the verge of closure because they can no longer afford to pay for the satellite providers and their other operating costs. Um, I would. It's also clear the Iranian regime is facing an unprecedented budget deficit. It's upwards of 26% of its GDP. It's something that's unsustainable, and it's going to draw down the Iranian regime's foreign currency reserves significantly at a clip of probably $20 billion of reserves this year, and perhaps 16 billion next year is the estimates we're working on. So you can see that the resources are diminishing.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Let's touch on a little bit. You mentioned working with regional allies. Could you clarify how we're working with some of those allies, the Gulf states, Israel, political dissidents in the Levant? You briefly touched upon this in Syria. How are we working on them to stabilize the region and counter Iranian ambitions?
Look, the first thing and the most important thing is that we have not acknowledged the threat that they're facing. We are no longer telling them, as some did in the past, that the Iranian regime is simply a factor in the region that the Arab countries are going to have to learn to live with and share the region with, and so on. We have acknowledged the reality that the Arab countries and others of Iran's neighbors are facing, which is that the Iranian regime has become an aggressive, hostile threat, an existential threat to some of them. And that's what the Iranian regime is trying to do. So we've simply, I think the most important thing that the Trump administration has done is to acknowledge that reality and get the fantasy out of our approach, our regional policy. This has had so many positive effects in our bilateral relationship, bilateral relations in the region, and our multilateral relations in the region. I mean, the Abraham Accords, I think, are a sign of that. Recently, the fact that Qatar and other GCC, the GCC members of the quartet, signaled that they would support us in efforts to try to prevent the lifting of the Iranian arms embargo, for example. I think these are signs. These are multilateral steps that we're taking, working with these allies to try to push back on this Iranian aggression.
Okay, I have one last question for you, and then we'll move on to our panelists. So, from your perspective, how do Iranian militias in the region, in Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, differ from one another? Where does the U.S. face the most risk? Where are you most concerned about U.S. national security, being at stake? Or, tell us a little bit more about how you're shaping the policies in each of those countries.
Okay, the first thing to note is that they're a threat everywhere. So we're talking just about nuances of gradations among different things that are all a threat. They're all a threat to U.S. presence, interests, our allies, and so on. I would say right now it seems clear that we face the most acute, immediate threat in Iraq, where there has been a series of attacks and plots, some of which haven't come to fruition, thank God, against the U.S. diplomatic presence, against the international coalition, against some other countries' diplomatic presence, against the United Nations, for example, these threats, and they seem to just be increasing. So that's become intolerable, which is, I mean, this is the subject of great discussions between us and our Iraqi friends right now. So I would say Iraq stands out right now. That doesn't mean that these other places that the Iranians have a very strong militant proxy presence rather, aren't a significant threat as well. It's something that could happen any day. The Iranians, from my experience now dealing with this threat for more than 15 years, tracking it as a military officer, now as a diplomat, it's something that the Iranians appear to be working on every day, is trying to lay plots, trying to destabilize the region around them.
Okay, great. Thank you. There's several other questions I would love to ask you, but we'll move on to our speakers now, and I'm sure the audience is going to have some additional questions for you at the end. So thank you very much for these opening remarks. I'm going to now move on to expand the discussion a little bit, and to all our panelists, feel free to respond and incorporate, into your answers some some responses to Das Rayburn's comments. But I'm going to go ahead and introduce our four outstanding experts on this topic. First, we have Ariane Tabtabai, who is the Middle East Fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and an adjunct senior research scholar at Columbia University. Prior to joining GMF, Ariane served as an associate political scientist at RAND and also taught at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. She's also the author of a new book, No Conquest, No Defeat, Iran's National Security Strategy. Congratulations on your new book. We're also joined by Michael Herzog, the Milton Fine International Fellow at the Washington Institute. Michael is a retired brigadier general in the Israel Defense Forces. Over the last decade, Michael held several senior positions, including chief of staff in the office of Israel's Minister of Defense. Over the years, he has played a key role in the Arab-Israeli peace process, participating in most of Israel's negotiations with the Palestinians, the Jordanians, and the Syrians. We're also joined by Hamdi Malik, Middle East analyst for Iran International TV. He is the author of Honored, Not Contained, The Future of Iraq's Popular Mobilization Forces. For more than a decade, his research investigated the political and security developments of post-Saddam Hussein Iraq. And since 2014, he's focused on the rise of ISIS, and his research has also focused on the transformation of the Shia militias in Iraq. And finally, we are joined by Nawar Shaban, who is a conflict analyst and expert, and a non-resident researcher at the Amran Center for Strategic Studies and Orsam Center. He was also named by Syria Deeply as one of the most significant military experts on Syria. So let me go ahead and begin our discussion. And first, I'd like to turn to Ariane. So Ariane, recently, Vice President Biden released an op-ed on his future policy on Iran. And in it, he stated that he would return to a nuclear deal, but would also pay heed to regional concerns by addressing Iranian malign behavior outside of its borders. What can you tell us about a possible future Democrat administration, how it would handle the militias in the Levant? Can the US realistically pressure Iran to withdraw its support for such forces? And which allies and partners with Vice President Biden work closely with to address these challenges? I know it's a lot, but we're looking forward to hearing from you on this.
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me, Jumana, and putting this really timely and fantastic panel together. I really appreciate it. So based off of what we know from the Democratic platform that was released a few weeks ago and the op-ed that you just mentioned from the Vice President on Iran policy, we know that, actually some of the things that Das Rayburn was just outlining are not just concerns for Republicans and this current administration. They're actually concerns that are shared by Democrats, and I would even say our allies in Europe and our partners in the region. And so if you go back to the 12 points that Secretary Pompeo laid out earlier in the administration in 2018, right after President Trump withdrew from the Iran deal, those main buckets of issues, Iran's nuclear activities, missile activities, regional activities, and support for terrorism, are all issues that are going to be facing the United States, regardless of which administration essentially is inaugurated in January. So that's the first thing to know. I think where we have major differences between the two parties, and where we're seeing major differences between the current administration on the one hand and our European allies on the other, is how do we pursue those objectives? And here, I think the CNN op-ed did a really good job of sort of describing some of the steps that the vice president would take. Though I should add that, there are obviously limits to what we know currently, both in public, but also I think in general, because it's not very clear what sort of Iran situation and Middle East situation a new administration would inherit. And there's a few things here that I think are quite clear, and there are a few unknown unknowns, right? The known unknowns are, first of all, that Iran can take a number of actions between now and January 2021, which would tremendously complicate a return to the JCPOA, for example, and other actions that the vice president and his administration may want to take to curb back Iranian malign influence. That can include, for example, a decision to withdraw from the nuclear deal. I don't think that's the most likely scenario right now. I think that, we have, and happy to come back to this later on, I think there is enough evidence to suggest that Iran wants to sort of sustain the status quo until the fate of our elections are known. But there are a number of unpredictable things that can happen that could lead in that direction. And then there's a set of things that can happen that are not actually directly tied to Iran, to Iran's decision-making. For example, the Israelis may decide that they actually want to take matters into their own hands between now and January and conduct actions that make it again more complicated to return to the deal. So in large part, I think how a new administration, a new democratic administration, handles the Iran portfolio is dependent on what happens between now, but I think more pertinently between November 3rd, or whenever the result of our elections are known, and January 2021. So that's the first thing I want to sort of outline. The second thing is going back to the op-ed and sort of what we know from both the vice president himself in the context of the debates and his advisors' comments on Iran. A return to the JCPOA, should Iran return to compliance with the deal, would be at the center of the new administration's Iran, a potential new administration's Iran policy. The second thing that I think the current administration, has actually has been a big missed opportunity for the current administration, is rebuilding alliances and partnerships and working with our European partners. Just the arms embargo saga that has been going on at the UN Security Council has deeply highlighted how isolated the United States has become on its Iran policy. And again, it's not because our allies in Europe and other countries don't share our concerns with weapons proliferation coming from Iran and going into Iran. It's because they fundamentally object to the way in which this administration has handled its Iran policy. So, multilateralism is, we know, a cornerstone of how the vice president thinks about international relations. And that would be, again, a big driver behind how he would address, or a big sort of component of the way he would address Iran policy. And then the next stage would be to build on the JCPOA and try to address other issues of behavior, other issues pertaining to Iran's foreign policy, which brings us to our topic at hand, which would then include, and I don't think that this would be done in the current sort of nuclear P5+1 format, but that would also include bringing together regional allies and partners, including, of course, consultations with the Israelis, including the Gulf Arabs, including non-state sort of friends and allies in the region, the Kurds, for example, and would seek to build on the JCPOA to address other areas of concern with Iran, which I think would be essentially a mix of preserving the sanctions on, under the terrorism authorities that exist currently. So lifting the nuclear sanctions should Iran comply with its nuclear obligations, but keeping those until a solution is reached on, in terms of curbing Iran's activities in the region, and working again with allies, with partners regionally and internationally to try to seek a diplomatic solution.
Okay. Great, thank you. Thank you very much for the very full answer. Let me now turn to Mike. So Mike, Israel has increased its targeting of Iranian militias in Syria over the past couple of years. What can you tell us about this decision to take on directly the elimination of Iranian threats in Syria? Has the operation had notable successes, and what challenges do you see are still outstanding?
Well, thank you, Jomana, and thank you for inviting me to participate. To your question, Israel has taken action against, or moved to take action against Iran and its proxies in its immediate vicinity in Syria after the war broke out, and Syria and Iran and its proxies started playing a role in that war. And Israel then moved to enforce so-called red lines, which were basically focused on the transfer of strategic weapons by Iran through and to Hezbollah through Syria or directly. Secondly, to prevent the creation of a military front in southern Syria on Israel's border. And thirdly, to maintain Israel's freedom of action, to enforce these red lines, especially overflights But this whole thing took a turn in 2016, 2017. In 2016, Qasem Soleimani designed a very ambitious plan for Syria in the wake of the JCPOA, and when it appeared that ISIS is on its way to fall. And that plan, its first part was about establishing what we call the land corridor. Essentially, it's a direct link from Iran through Iraq and Syria to the Mediterranean, but also to Israel's border. And the completing part of this plan was to build a formidable military front facing Israel in Syria itself, much the way as Iran has done in Lebanon with Hezbollah, with over 100,000 rockets aimed at Israel. That was Soleimani's idea. And in concrete terms, that plan spoke, according to Israeli intelligence, spoke about deploying Iranian troops in Syria, deploying planes, drones, building a militia army of up to 100,000 people, mostly Shiite militias from across the region, taking part in the defense industry in Syria, deploying rockets, huge numbers of them, and above all, the so-called precision project, namely turning part of Hezbollah's arsenal of rockets into high precision ones, which from Israeli point of view is a huge challenge. When that plan came about, Israel in early 2017 took a strategic decision to launch a campaign against the Iranian deployment in Syria, not every bit of it, but those more strategic parts of it that would pose an unbearable military threat to the state of Israel. And we're talking here about a campaign. It's not just responding to specific Iranian acts. It was a full-fledged campaign, and since then, Israel is taking action numerous times in what's called in the IDF dictionary, the campaign between the wars, namely something that is below a certain level that leads to a war, but delays the potential for war. If you ask me about how successful this campaign has been, I would say quite successful, not 100%, but quite successful. If you take the original Qasem Soleimani plans and you compare it to what happened in Syria, you see that most of their plans have not materialized, mostly because of the IDF pressure. There were other reasons as well, like Russians and so on. For example, the Iranian wanted a foothold in at least one of the Syrian ports on the Mediterranean and were denied that by the Russians, but most of it was the IDF military pressure. So most of the plans were thwarted by the pushback from Israel and the IDF. They had to adjust the deployment and mode of operation in Syria, hide a lot of it. It became more diffused, less concentrated in certain areas. They tried to distance themselves from Israel, believing that this will deny Israel certain operational options. And I think they are, by and large, they are under pressure. We didn't reach a point where Iran decides to leave Syria militarily. The ambitions are still there. And I don't think we're at a point where, Iran just gave up on Syria. Certainly far away from that. But Iran is under pressure in Syria, also for other reasons. And I think a major part of it was Israel's operation campaign against them.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Very interesting. I'm going to turn now real quickly to Hamdi. We're trying to cover a couple of different countries here, so I'm going to pivot to Iraq real quick. Hamdi, for the past few months, targeted assassinations of prominent Iraqi scholars and activists such as Hisham al-Hashim have been carried out without a single subsequent arrest. Many of those assassinations were captured even on tape. And evidence of the popular mobilization forces being behind those assassinations are quite well-founded. Why has there been no accountability for these assassinations?
Thank you very much indeed for having me. So the short answer is that the new Prime Minister, Mustafa al-Kadhimi, does not have the power to bring the killers to justice. So as the commander-in-chief, he has only full control on two military organizations, or two security and military organizations in Iraq. One is the counterterrorism, and the other one is the intelligence service that he has been heading since 2016. The counterterrorism is a very, very professional and efficient force, but it's not a big force. So they have around 15,000 personnel. Around 60% of them are only combat personnel. And the intelligence service is actually supposed to deal with foreign threats rather than threats inside the country. Other security forces, including the Interior Minister and the police, the federal police, and also the PMF and the army, they're not necessarily obeying al-Kadhimi's orders. And that's why when he wanted to, for example, bring to justice the kidnappers of one of the young activists in Nasiriyah, he sent counterterrorism forces. And obviously he was criticized by many security and military figures indirectly because he did not trust thousands of security and military forces in Nasiriyah. And at the end of the day, he was not able to actually bring to justice the kidnappers, and the person who has been kidnapped, still his destiny is not known. The other example is when he tried to stop rocket attacks. So he again sent his trusted people, the counterterrorism, to arrest 14 Qatar Hezbollah fighters. And immediately after that, around 150 Qatar Hezbollah fighters drove to his residence in the international zone, intimidated him, and effectively forced him to free them. So even inside the international zone, the green zone, Mantiq al-Khadra, he does not have the authority to stop people from entering this very, very important zone. Simply because since, especially in the last 2 years, and especially the last 1 year, Qatar Hezbollah, which is now, I would argue, is the most powerful Iranian proxy in Iraq, has been able to infiltrate in many areas. So very simple, he has made a lot of threats to bring to justice killers of Riham, the female activist in Basra, Hisham al-Hashimi, the famous commentator, and many others. But simply, he does not have the authority. It's as simple as that. That is the stark fact in Iraq.
Thank you, Hamdi. Quite depressing. Let's move on to Nawad real quick to tie in. We've talked about Syria, throughout several of these other conversations, but I want you to hone in a little bit. We know that there's been an increase in Iranian activity, both hard power, so physical presence, as well as soft power. You're writing a blog post for us right now that's even talked about Iran setting up hospitals in Deir ez-Zor, very close to US force presence. Can you tell us a little bit more about this? Where is Iranian-backed activity most concentrated in Syria right now? How much is Iran relying on soft power versus hard power in Syria, in places like Damascus and Deir ez-Zor?
Thank you, Jumana. Thank you for my fellow panelists. In the beginning, first of all, when everyone talk about the Iranian presence, it's always limited to the military presence of Iran in Syria. It's a threat. It's a major threat for the nearby country. But for Syrian, Iran was able to create a totally new power, new problem that affected the whole Syrian structure. Iran, since 2017, Iran was trying to create new methods and tactics that allowed them to infiltrate new fields in Syria, such as the community, such as the business field, social civilian. Iran targeted specific areas that these areas that suffered a long time of ISIS presence or siege or whatever, and they have lousy livelihood situations. So what Iran, they are yet not focusing on the quality of their project that they are doing in Syria. They basically focus on the quantity of the project. They focus on the how to spread more in new geographical location. For example, in Deir ez-Zor, they don't focus on building like top major hospitals or top major schools. They choose a very small village and they create a very small medical point. This is a new tactic for Iran. It's not something random they are doing. This is the major problem, because Iran, by doing that, they were able to infiltrate the society. They were able to plant their seeds way deep. Targeting the military location for the Iranian is always there is always an advantage for that. But how to target Iran while they are building their seeds, planting their seeds within the society itself, while they are doing a new business relationship with new network of businessmen. The known businessmen in Syria are well known to everyone, and they are being targeted by sanction. Every set of new sanction by Caesar Act, it's always targeting like known people. But there is a new network. There is a new network of businessmen that Iran was able to build in the several last years. This is the most difficult thing right now, how to target the local presence for the Iranian. That's why Iran, since 2017, focused on the soft power. Okay, their bases, their known bases is being targeted always by the Israeli or by any other force, but is it affecting their long-term project in Syria? No, it's not. It's targeting a specific goal. It's targeting a specific shipment of armory, but their presence in Syria, it's not being affected. They are still there, and they are still doing the small project that in the long term is affecting them and giving them profit in Syria.
Thank you, Nawad. Ariane, I'd like to come back to you. And let's go back to the beginning of this year and the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani. Now, I remember at the time you wrote and spoke extensively about how you disagreed with President Trump, that it would make America safer because it wouldn't actually change the calculus of Iran strategically, only tactically. In the 9 months since his assassination, what lasting impact, positive or negative, has the assassination had on Iran's ability to deploy troops in the Levant?
Yeah, thanks for the for the trip down memory lane many decades ago in January. Right? So just to clarify before I start answering your question, that I didn't disagree with the president's decision to kill Soleimani just because I didn't think that it would change Iran's strategic game plan. Or because I didn't agree with the administration that Soleimani was a despicable human who was responsible for much atrocity in the region. My concerns were that it wasn't clear to me that the costs of this action would not outweigh the benefits of them. And I think that in the few months that have passed since then, we have seen some second order effects that actually point in that direction. And I should also point out that Iran has made it plenty clear that they're not done with their retaliation yet. And in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, one of the top commanders in the IRGC said that even the missile strikes against the 2 bases in Iraq that house US troops were not actually about retaliation. They were about restoring deterrence from their perspective. So much seems to be still on the way, and we don't know when and how that response will be formulated, if it will be formulated even. But my concerns were that it wasn't clear to me that we were going to be getting as much out of it as the administration had said, and that perhaps the administration was downplaying or underestimating the cost that would be associated with this. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that as the fantastic volumes that the army put out on the history of the Iraq War that actually Rayburn was involved with in his previous capacity shows we have a history of playing inadvertently into Iran's hands, and that was another concern of mine, that we might be taking actions that would actually, in the long run, make our lives a lot more complicated and make it much more difficult to deal with with the challenges that Iran poses, including, for example, potential changes in Iran's nuclear calculations based off of the killing of Soleimani, which again is, I think, too early to actually fully estimate. But these were all things that were concerning to me then. They're concerning to me now. Another concern that I had was that it would be distracting to the de-ISIS operations that we've spent so much time, our allies have spent so much time and resources trying to complete, and that not having finished one thing, we were jumping into another thing that we weren't fully prepared to deal with. So that was part of my, that was again another one of my concerns. I think as of today, it is still too early to say, with all of what I've outlined here, what the actual implications of Soleimani's death are, how it is actually going to change the way Iran thinks about and operates in the region. I think there, again, and going back to your point, I think there have been some tactical, perhaps, shifts that are positive. We know that, Soleimani's successor, Ismail Ghani, is not as well versed in the region, in the Levant part of Iran's portfolio as his predecessor was, right? He doesn't speak Arabic, he doesn't have the same charisma, he doesn't have the same relationships as Soleimani did. He is much more well versed in Iran's relations with Afghanistan. So that might be a positive, I think, in terms of undercutting Iran's influence in the Levant. But the other thing too that I want to highlight is that we should be careful when we think about timelines here, because I think we tend to sort of think about our timelines and project them onto the way other decision makers think, right? Iran has its own timelines. Going back to 2018, for example, after President Trump withdrew from the deal, many were anticipating that after a few months, Iran had responded, and therefore, that was it, right? That Iran was going to be sitting on its hands. And then a year later, Iran started to introduce its own timeline, and it started to actually take actions that were calibrated in a way that would make sense from its own perspective. So we have to be careful to think about how Iran responds, how it calibrates its operations, how it responds to a specific situation, and see how that actually ultimately plays out. The final thing that I want to sort of leave out, that I want to leave you with, is that it's really hard from my perspective to be able to actually just kind of take out the Soleimani killing as a variable from Iran's actions more generally, right? There are so many other things going on right now. The maximum pressure campaign more generally, and the effect of sanctions is of course one. You have the impact of COVID-19 on Iran, which has been disastrously managed by the country, by the regime. And you have also the state of Iran's operations more generally in the region. The fact that in Syria, for example, going back to Navar's point, Iran today is not looking at the same situation in Syria. From its perspective, a phase of the operations have ended. It is now much more focused on sort of, what happens next. It is now much more focused on soft power than it is on sending its own forces. And also, and we can come back to this in a bit, but from my perspective, Iran never went to Syria to keep a large footprint forever. In that country. There's a reason why they started to deploy proxies pretty early on in the conflict. It was to minimize the cost on themselves. That's how Iran operates. So we also have to be careful not to sort of isolate one variable without knowing how that impacts Iran's calculations in general. And so I think I'll sort of leave it here. I hope that answered your question.
That more than answers it. Thank you. Thank you very much. Mike, I want to pivot a little bit because we haven't talked much about Hezbollah yet. And this is obviously, Israel's concern is not just about, Iranian militias in Syria, but obviously the threat at its border coming from Lebanon. So there's been reports of escalating tensions between Hezbollah and Israel over the last several months. We know that this is an ongoing pattern, obviously, but from the Israeli perspective, can you tell us if there's been any positive impact from the maximum pressure campaign that it's had on reducing the Hezbollah threat at all? And while I know that Hezbollah's existence at large is a very significant challenge for Israel, what are the most pressing challenges sort of emanating from Hezbollah at the moment, given the unrest there, the economic disaster, the many other, the greater Lebanese domestic turmoil taking place?
There is definitely a lot of tension between Israel and Hezbollah along the border. I mean, Israel and Hezbollah have a history of hostilities going back decades, but in concrete terms, right now, the reason there is tension is because Hezbollah operates not only in Lebanon, but elsewhere, and because Hassan Nasrallah set a kind of a formula whereby if Israel hits one of their people, they will hit an Israeli soldier, kind of one for one. And it so happens that when Israel took action against an Iranian target in the vicinity of Damascus International Airport several months back, one of Hezbollah's operatives was there and he was killed. And then Nasrallah once again vowed to kill an Israeli in revenge. And Hezbollah indeed tried to take revenge along the border. In July, they sent a group of formed armed people to Mount Dov near the Shaba farms, tried to infiltrate and take action against an Israeli military position. They were spotted, they were driven away. Later on, Hezbollah snipers tried to kill Israeli soldiers along the Israel-Lebanon border, and there were other minor incidents. And in each and every case, Israel retaliated. In the last event I mentioned, along the Israel-Lebanon border, Israeli helicopters destroyed some Hezbollah observation posts along the border with Israel, which is something that hasn't happened since 2006, since the Second Lebanon War, even though these observation posts were unmanned. I think that from Israeli perspective, Hezbollah is restrained and deterred. It has no appetite for another war. And there are several reasons behind that. You mentioned the US maximum pressure campaign. It definitely has a price for Hezbollah because according to Israeli information, the level of Iranian financial support to Hezbollah has gone down by at least 40% in recent years. But it's not only that, it's also the financial economic meltdown of Lebanon itself, the fact that the state is faltering, the fact that Hezbollah itself is under sanctions, and the Caesar Act also added to that because of the trade relations between Syria and Lebanon. And most of all, recently, I would say the domestic pressure on Hezbollah, public pressure against Hezbollah in Lebanon, which you could see in demonstrations, criticism coming even from within the Shiite community. And you saw even more of it after the big blast in Beirut. People are pointing a finger at Hezbollah. And it's more and more a matter of public discussion in Lebanon. And there are other reasons, COVID, Qasem Soleimani, which, by the way, from an Israeli perspective, the benefits of taking him out far outweigh the costs, but I put that aside. So taken together, the picture we see is that Hezbollah is very much restrained, has no desire to escalate to war. It will continue to take small, kind of below the line operations so as not to escalate, because it does want to establish kind of the equation where it also deters Israel and not allows Israel to do what it pleases, but all in a very, very calculated manner. By the way, Israel itself is not interested in war, and I can just give you one example. When Hezbollah sent these armed people to the vicinity of Shaba farms, the IDF decided not to kill them, but drive them away, and to this day did not release the footage of these guys. At the same time, when you look at Hezbollah, you see that the equation that Nasrallah puts forward is one of their people against one Israeli soldier. It's not 1 to 100, it's 1 to 1. It's not an Israeli civilian, it's an Israeli soldier. They're very, very calculated. But the potential for escalation is there because, as we have seen, and we are very much experienced of that, there's always room for miscalculation on both sides.
Sure, thank you. Hamdi, let's loop back over to Iraq really quick. So the Iranian-backed militias have been able to increase their coffers from areas that are not their natural homes, such as Mosul. We've been hearing about this lately, by extorting local populations, forcing people to pay for things outside of the state apparatus, taxes, etc. They've also, resorted to kidnappings. Can you tell us more about sort of the increasing economic power of these militias? And I know you're about to have a blog post that writes a little bit about this, but if you could share with the audience what the new prime minister can or should do about militia corruption in Iraq.
This is actually a very important question. There are different sources of revenue that these militias are actually exploiting. Oil smuggling, border trade, tolling, the roads, the currency auction, obviously is a little bit more complicated. I need to explain that more. But for example, with oil smuggling, at least since 2015, some pro-Iran units took control of some oil fields in 3 Sunni majority regions or provinces, the Diyala province, the Nainawa and the Salahuddin, and they are using tankers to smuggle oil from these oil fields to Iran and other markets by truck. The border trade is a little bit more complicated. So there are two strategies or two actually dimensions to the border trade. One is exploiting trade through the legal border points and customs, which is very corrupted. Everybody knows in Iraq, this is a very corrupt department in Iraq, and not only Iran-backed militias are actually using this for to generate revenue. Other forces, including tribal forces and political parties, they are using the points that are legally established in Iraq in order to generate money. The other source of border trade is actually establishing illegal border points. For example, at the border with Syria, Iranian-backed militias, especially the Tufuf and Kataib Hezbollah, has 3 border points completely out of the control of the state. So no state agent is actually overseeing what's going on there. One of them is the Imam Ali point, which is very close to the Iranian Imam Ali military base in the other side of the border. And the Iranian-backed militias are actually, and obviously IRGC agents are using this border point in order to smuggle equipment. We know that Iran tried to build 2 tunnels in Imam Ali base, and it was destroyed by the Israeli airstrikes, and also fighters. But it's not limited to, so the activities are not limited to fighters and arms. They also use this point in order to generate money. The other source of revenue is tolling. So as we mentioned in our monograph about the PMF, a government official estimated that Asa'ib al-Haq, again, another proxy very close to Iran, generated $300,000 a day in 2017 through illegal checkpoints only in Jalala. Jalala is a very small town. Obviously, it's close to the Iranian border, so it's strategic, but still, only in Jalala, only one militia is generating this amount of money. So again, tolling is very important also for them. The currency auction is actually very interesting. So in order to prevent Iraqi currency depreciation, the Iraqi central bank has 5 auctions every week through which the business people can go and buy dollars at a certain price in order to import goods to Iraq. And this has been a very important source of corruption for many groups, including the Iran-backed militias. This auction, so in this auction, around 150 to 300 million dollars a day is sold by the Iraqi central bank. I just checked today. Today's number, the 1st of October, was 165 million, more than 165 million dollars. And obviously, what they do, they acquire the money in order to import goods, but they do not import the goods. And obviously, the corruption in the customs and border points help them to generate money through these venues. The last thing, I'm not going to go to the details, I'm not sure we have time for that, but also government tenders. So in order to build bridges, to roads, hospitals, and all these contracts actually go to, some of them go to these militias through the so-called economy offices that actually many prime ministers, the previous prime ministers tried to close down, but they haven't been able to do that.
So actually, I was just going to briefly, in terms of the new prime minister, what were you recommending that he should or can do?
So what
Go ahead.
Yeah, so what he has been trying to do is, first of all, he hasn't touched the illegal border points, for example. He hasn't gone there. That's a very dangerous area. It's controlled by groups like Kataib Hezbollah and Badr on the Iranian side, Kataib Hezbollah on the Syrian side of the border. And he hasn't touched that area. He knows that it's very dangerous to go there, and it might actually, he will be faced with resistance. He has been trying to reduce corruption in the legal border points. To be honest with you, my sources tell me, obviously this is very recent, so we need to wait for a few months to see what happens. But my sources tell me that it has not been actually very successful. When it comes to oil smuggling, nothing has been done yet. And the currency auction as well, nothing has been done. Obviously, the issue of currency auction has been going on for ages, and many people have been talking about them, about the problem here. Again, not specifically limited to Iran-backed militias. Many other corrupt people are using it, but to me, it doesn't seem that actually the Iran-backed militias have been cut. Or their revenues have been cut. Obviously, their revenues from Iran has been cut, and also we can say that because of the pressure on the Iraqi budget, the amount of money available in order to steal, if you like, is more limited. But in terms of cracking down on illicit trade and activities, I haven't seen, to be honest with you, or actually the research community hasn't seen any real change.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I have one last question for Nawad briefly before we open it up. We have some good questions from the audience. So Nawad, could you just talk to us a little bit about the relationship between Iranian-backed militias and the Syrian army and the Syrian state? I know that you've been writing about this a lot. Can you share with the audience what you think are the most important lines of intersection?
Thank you, Zulmana. That's a great question, but I can talk a lot about this question. So basically, within the regimes, within the military or security branches, security structure, there's different groups within the regime. Some of them are pro-Russian, some of them are pro-Iranian, and some of them are separated and work in an individual way, separated themselves from the international influence. But how did Iran actually took advantage of that? The regime itself, they have lack of resources of like rehabilitating and rebuilding their security, their damaged security structure in some specific area, mainly the area that they were able to recapture, such as Deir ez-Zor. That's where Iran took an advantage of that and took under their wing the military security branch. And through Deir ez-Zor military security branch, they used it as a gate to have some kind of foot on different provinces. Yani they were able to build some kind of a network that led for some kind of feud between different security branches. So basically trying to say is they have a very difficult relationship within the regime. Some of them see them as a competitor. Some of them see them as a threat. Some of them still see them as an ally. It depends on the province. It depends on the geographical location. It actually depends how much Iran to plant their seeds. For example, in Deir ez-Zor, Iran is not facing any kind of problem when they are trying to operate. They even till this day they operate through their non-Syrian militia, and no one is putting any obstacle on the road, because basically what Iran was able to do was able to build a very strong structure for them in Deir ez-Zor. But on the other hand, for example, in Daraa, still until this day, Iran have presence through local entities and through even military structures such as the 313th Brigade in Israel. But Iran is facing a lot of problem, either through the ongoing feud with the 5th Corps, the 8th Brigade, Ahmad al-Ouda, the ex-opposition, through the ongoing assassination, basically because Iran did not able to do the same project as they did in Deir ez-Zor or in eastern Aleppo. So what I'm trying to say is that there was always and there will always be that same kind of feud between within the regime itself, but it's different from each area to another. Some areas it's obvious, some areas it's not visible at all, and this is why Iran, and that's the whole thing that Iran is taking advantage of. They are playing on this like gap. Always Iran is searching for a gap within either the regime structure, within the international relation, within the campaigns, always searching for a gap that they will always take advantage of. And this gap is the core of the problem of the Iranian presence. It's always this gap. It's always the thing that no one is thinking about. And on a long term, that's becoming a very huge hole. It's becoming more a big problem for not only the Syrian, for everyone around Syria.
Thank you, Nawad. Okay, so we have a series, I think, of really great questions. So I want to give everyone the opportunity. But Das Rayburn, are you still with us? Because we have a few questions for you. So I know we haven't chatted with you in a bit, but I'm going to start off. We have a couple of questions from Barbara Slavin. So I'm going to go ahead and start with that, and they're directed to you. How does the U.S. reduction in forces in Syria and Iraq impact the U.S. ability to be able to reduce Iranian influence there? Also, you say that Iran is the most destabilizing force in the region. What about the U.S.-backed Saudi war in Yemen? And then she had a follow-up question. I'm just going to go ahead and throw it out there now, which is, you say maximum pressure has worked, but Iran was not attacking U.S. personnel in Iraq from 2015 to 2018. When the U.S. withdrew from the JCPOA. Can you please comment on that and how withdrawing has helped stabilize the region?
Yeah. So the reduction in U.S. forces doesn't have to do with the maximum pressure campaign against the Iranian regime. The forces that are on the ground, the U.S. military forces that are on the ground in Iraq and Syria, are there as part of the counter-ISIS campaign. The maximum pressure campaign on Iran, the centerpiece of that is the economic pressure, the political isolation, and multilateral action, and so on. It was under the JCPOA, I think, there were a lot of people who have strange upside-down ideas about what the Iranian regime was doing under the JCPOA. The Iranian regime under the JCPOA in 2016, 2017, a little bit of 2018 had a windfall of oil revenues. What did they do with that money? We know from our own sources, but then later confirmed when Hassan Rouhani published the Iranian government budget, that the Iranian regime increased its military and intelligence spending by more than 20% each year, 2016 and 2017. In other words, they greatly expanded their ability to wreak havoc in the region. And then they started wreaking havoc in the region. It was under the JCPOA that Qasem Soleimani did what Michael Herzog pointed out, which is to try to create a strategic road running from Iran all the way over through Iraq and Syria and into Lebanon, and then began trying to create new fronts in the war against Israel and a potential threat to Jordan and Turkey. I'm sorry, but Ariane is wrong when she says she assumes that the Iranian regime didn't intend to set up a big footprint, a military footprint in Syria. They absolutely did. It was absolutely enormous. It's still enormous. They're still trying. That's why the Israeli Air Force bombs them, is because the Iranian regime is still trying to bring in strategic weapons and to establish strategic bases. To put things in there like ballistic missiles and armed drones that they can use, not just against Israel, and they have used them against Israel, but also against Jordan, against Turkey, against Iraqis, against the Kurdistan regional government of Iraq, for example, against the Saudis and against us and many others. So it's absolutely, as I say, it's prima facie the most destabilizing factor in the Middle East. As for Yemen, Yemen's not in my lane. What I would say, I mean, I don't see any regional spillover from the war in Yemen, other than the Quds Force going to Yemen and working with the Houthis and Lebanese Hezbollah to fire ballistic missiles and cruise missiles at Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi. That's the destabilizing factor of the war in Yemen. I also don't understand why people seem to act as though it wasn't the fact that the Iranian regime, through Qasem Soleimani and his minions, with Lebanese Hezbollah's help, assisted the Houthis in overthrowing the government of Yemen, the Yemeni state, which is the thing that set all this conflict in motion in the first place. I need to address something that was said about the killing of Qasem Soleimani. Qasem Soleimani was a military commander who was on a battlefield, who, as he had been doing for many years, was plotting attacks and having his forces carry out attacks in that theater against Americans and against American allies. And so it seems a little perverse to me to criticize the Trump administration for taking action to stop what Qasem Soleimani was doing, or to wring hands about the Trump administration's response to what Qasem Soleimani was doing against Americans, and no hand-wringing, no anxiety at all, ever, about what Qasem Soleimani was doing in the first place. The whole region knows Qasem Soleimani was a killer. He killed people from all countries that he dealt with. No one, virtually no one, is sad to see him gone. I would say that's true even in Iran. You can know when the fake crying in Iran over Qasem Soleimani took place because the IRGC guys are masters at it. The fake crying looks like this. They cover their faces and then they bob up and down as though they're sobbing. The Iraqi Shia militants and Hezbollah are good at it too. But that's the way. They also sometimes wipe away tears that aren't really there, but in a way all the way down so you can't see that their eyes weren't really wet to begin with. Qasem Soleimani used to do that too. I think people underestimate the degree to which Qasem Soleimani was executing the supreme leader Ali Khamenei's policy personally in the region, and it was to destabilize the region and to create new Iranian regime spheres of influence in the Arab countries and in Afghanistan. And he was doing that in Iraq through Abu Mehdi al-Muhandis, who was also killed in that January strike. The Iraqis, virtually no Iraqis will miss Qasem Soleimani or Abu Mehdi al-Muhandis. And they won't say that in public. They'll beat their chests and cry and so on. In private, they're all glad he's gone, and it was long overdue.
Thank you, Das Rayburn. We're gonna go ahead. Ariane, I don't know if you'd like to respond, but I would also, I'll go ahead and there was a question that I think is probably best answered by you, and that was the Iranian foreign minister's statements that he recently made, I believe at CFR, where he said Iran must be recompensed for damages it has suffered because the US withdrew from the JCPOA before it would consider negotiating a new agreement. Can you comment on this, whether or not this would, be waived, or how would this impact possible, Vice President Biden presidency or plans to pivot back to a JCPOA? And then you're welcome to quickly address Das Rayburn's comments if you'd like.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll start with that last question about the damages. It's actually not clear to me yet that there is a consensus in Iran that at least we know of about what the damages requested would look like. I will go ahead and say that I don't know of anyone, even in the Democratic Party, who would accept damages, though. So that might be one of the tricky things for a potential new Biden administration to deal with. So, if Iran is looking to come to the table and request, millions of dollars in damages, I think that that might be a challenge. I do want to quickly address a couple of things that Das Rayburn said. The first one is his comment about my comment about the footprint. I want to be very specific because my comment was about large Iranian, not Iranian-backed proxies, footprint in Syria. And again, I'll go back to what I was stating. If you look at the history of Iran's intervention in Syria, from the get-go, Iran intervened with the hope that it would be a quick conflict, that it would secure its partner Assad, and it would essentially, leave a small, perhaps, footprint, but essentially most of its forces would return back home. As the conflict began to drag on, and it became clear that that was not going to be the case, Iran quickly started to mobilize its proxies so that it wouldn't have to deploy its own Iranian forces and put them on the ground in Syria. And that has several reasons. The first one is that the Syrian civil war was one of the most controversial items on Iran's foreign policy agenda in recent years. It was much more controversial than some of Iran's other activities for a variety of reasons, which we can talk about. And second, because it was also the largest sort of deployment since the Iran-Iraq war, which a lot of Iranians, including within the regime, didn't really like, right? When body bags started to go back to Iran and people weren't understanding why their forces were in Syria to begin with, from Iran's perspective, sending proxies became the way forward. And so I think that, the footprint question is not about whether or not Iran wants to have proxies in Syria. Of course, it wants to maintain its influence in Syria. There's no question about that. But in terms of the specific Iranian footprint, I disagree with Das Rayburn there. So that's the first thing. The second thing I want to point out is going back to Devar's I think, great point about Iran using vacuums. I think he said gaps, vacuums in the region. Again, we shouldn't be conflating several things. It's really easy to point to the JCPOA and said the JCPOA is the reason for all of Iran's evils. It's not. Iran's policies in the region didn't start with the JCPOA. They didn't even start with the Islamic Republic, frankly, in a lot of ways, right? Iran's support for Shia militias in other countries actually predates the Islamic Republic. It is a much more nefarious way of doing it today, and it's a lot costlier today than it had been in the past. But it didn't start with the JCPOA. Iran was exploiting vacuums that were existing in the region, regardless of the JCPOA. The Syrian civil war would have started regardless of the JCPOA, right? And that is one of the key reasons why, and here I think I agree with essentially everyone, that Iran saw a strategic opportunity to create this sort of land bridge from its own territory all the way to Lebanon, in part to have a presence close to Israel, in part to have access to the Mediterranean, and it leveraged that opportunity. So I think it would be mistaken to say that the JCPOA was the gap or the reason why Iran is able to be involved in Syria.
Thank you, Ariane. Mike, I'm going to pull you in here. There's a question from Lawrence Silverman about Hezbollah. And he asks, do you see an opportunity and you touched on this a little bit, but maybe you could give us a little more specifics. Do you see an opportunity in the very difficult situation in Lebanon for countries to make an effort to weaken Hezbollah and Iran's influence over the Lebanese political system?
I definitely see an opportunity. I think Hezbollah is at a very, very low point, Nader, the lowest that I can remember in Hezbollah's history, and I think they have acute dilemmas. They are the strongest military and political power in Lebanon, but the state is falling apart. Lebanon is melting down. Lebanon is on the verge of economic collapse. Nothing functions there. The whole place is falling apart. So what can Hezbollah do in such a case? How can it translate its military and political power? What we see now is that all attempts at bringing about political reform, establishing a new government, changing things in Lebanon, changing the sectarian system that existed there for decades since Lebanon's independence, they are falling apart first and foremost because of Hezbollah. The recent attempt to establish a government in Lebanon was thwarted because Hezbollah and Amal as well demanded that the finance ministry will be held by a Shiite. Probably they wanted one of their people in that office. So I think it's time that international actors, first of all, I think there's a lot of resentment against Hezbollah in Lebanon itself. Not only in the Maronite or Sunni communities, but also in the Shiite communities. I hear a lot of it. And you see a lot of it also coming out here and there in social media. But international actors who look at Lebanon should come to the conclusion that Hezbollah is not part of the solution. It is a big part of the problem. I think Macron, with all his good intentions and going to Lebanon and all that, is gradually coming to this conclusion. We just saw him criticize Hezbollah in an unprecedented manner, especially saying, they should choose whether they are a political party, part of the government, an army fighting Israel, an armed militia fighting in Syria, or an agent of a foreign country, namely Iran. They should make a choice here. And one way to translate this, I think, is for the international community to designate Hezbollah as a terror organization in its entirety, not only the military wing, but also the political wing, all of Hezbollah. And more countries are coming to these conclusions. We've seen the UK, we've seen Germany, we see more countries in Europe thinking about it. So I think there's an opportunity here to push back against Hezbollah and to pressure Hezbollah, both from within Lebanon and from outside Lebanon.
Okay. We have a lot of great questions. Nawad, I want to ask you, there's a question by Ibrahim Al-Asil from the Middle East Institute. He asked, from your perspective, what interests would Iran like to secure in Syria? And what role are Iranian militias playing to achieve some goals? So I know you gave us a general idea, but their longer term goal in Syria, from what you're following, what do you think that is?
Thank you. It's a great question by Ibrahim. So basically, I'm gonna tackle the question from a different angle. The Iranian goal, I'm not gonna say to have the same military presence, to have the same influence, but let me tackle what did they do, what kind of foundation did they do at the time being for their future goal? From seeing the foundation, from seeing their current current goals or current achieving, you can understand what exactly they are trying to achieve in the future. For example, business-wise, everyone was talking about it in 2018. They in a way reactivated the Syrian-Iranian business forum, and for everyone that was a major problem. But my major concern is their relationship with small entity, business entity, their relationship with small contractor. This is one point. Other point is how they were able to integrate their local militia within the regime army, within the security branches, such as the local defense forces within the army, some of the old militia, the Abu Fadl Abbas forces, not the brigade. The brigade is over. The force is still available. It's within the Republican Guard, a 313 brigade within the army in Daraa. That's another point. Third point is their cells that are activating in different areas. For example, I'm just going to give a very small example for what kind of foundation they did. For example, in Al-Hasaka, basically in Al-Shaddada, not so far from the American presence in Shaddada. In 2019, there was a contractor company that was responsible of doing some kind of restructuring for the telecommunication network. That company was owned by Al-Qatarji. Al-Qatarji have a direct support from Iran. Al-Qatarji is, by the way, until now, in 2020, he had 3 projects in Al-Hasaka, in Al-Shaddada. That's a major problem. Iran was able to secure this foundation. So they basically, once you look about this foundation, adding their role in infiltrating the society, their support for Boy Scouts, they do support Boy Scouts. They do have 4 Boy Scouts, either in Deir Zor and Aleppo. Put them all together, smash them all together, you will find their final goal in Syria. Their final goal in Syria is to spread like a spider web. Spider web is not that strong, but it's spreading. It's not like a small spider web. Take it, for example, it's like a Harry Potter spider web. It's a very large spider web that cover all Syria different fields. That's the major problem about the Iran goal in the future.
Thank you, Nawad. Thank you. Das Raven, we have a question from Vladimir von Wilgenberg. And he asks, will the US protect the Kurdistan region if Iran-backed groups attack again, like what happened in Erbil yesterday?
Well, I think the better question is, is the Iraqi government and the Iraqi security forces going to defend Iraqi territory from attacks by Iran-backed militant groups, whether it was of the kind that was seen in Erbil or the string of attacks that has been taking place in Baghdad and elsewhere. Because what these groups are out to do is to divide Iraq, is to get, they target the international diplomatic presence, not just Americans, because they want to see Iraq isolated and weak so that it can be under the decisive influence, basically, of the Iranian regime and the Quds Force. I think it's a time where we really, it's incumbent on the Iraqi government to step up and do that.
Okay.
Because Iraq needs the world. Iraq needs its regional relations. Iraq needs the international community. Iraq needs to be integrated in the international community. And so this is something all Iraqis have an interest in, not seeing this Iranian gambit play out.
Sure. Hamdi, there's a very specific question from Ina Rudolph, which asks, which two other illegal points in addition to Imam Ali are being exploited for informal trade? And what steps can be taken to draw a clear line between the operations of the Islamic resistance factions and the mandate of their PMU registered brigades?
So the first question, obviously, these are no-go zones. Obviously, especially when Qatar Hezbollah controls an area, they do not allow anyone to enter whatsoever. This is the way they function, even in some residential area or agriculture area south of Baghdad. That's very famous. But our sources tell us that there's one point south of Euphrates, Al-Furat, along the oil pipeline, and the other one is even down south around Akashat, which is completely controlled by Qatar Hezbollah at the moment, is close to the Syrian Tanaf. And the second question is a $1 million question. Obviously, that is a very big problem for Iraq, because these groups are supposed to be, according to the Hashed law or the PMF law of 2017, they are supposed to be under the control of the state, and they are supposed to actually answer to the commander-in-chief, the prime minister. But in fact, they're not doing this. Many of them. So the PMF is not a homogeneous, obviously, body. But the commission, which is designed to regulate and organizes the activities of PMF, has been dominated by Iran-backed groups, specifically by Qatar Hezbollah, facilitated by Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, and also by Badr organization. But in recent years, before al-Muhandis's assassination, actually Qatar Hezbollah was getting the upper hand. One thing that actually the Prime Minister can do is to diversify the chain of command in the PMF, and bring in some more patriotic commanders who are not necessarily interested in answering to the Iranian IRGC Quds Force. But that's one thing. Again, it's not an easy job to do, because after Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis was assassinated, Qatar Hezbollah forced their own candidate, Abu Fadek, as the acting chief of staff, and he's again very influential inside the commission at this stage. Also what they can do is to actually try to change other commanders, the unit commanders. So recently, for example, 2 unit commanders or brigade commanders have been replaced by 2 other people, but one of them is the Khurasani and the other one is the Shabak militia. But even the new 2 leaders are completely close to Iran. Everybody knows them, and one of them even has many pictures with Abu Fadek. This is not an easy task to do, but obviously these are the solutions. Last thing I can say is to leverage the differences between the pro-Sistani groups, the Atabat units, because they are very unhappy with Iran's influence inside the commission, and they have been trying to actually defect, and there are four units are under the command of the Prime Minister directly. What the Prime Minister can do is to threaten to expand this line of defection, and I know from my sources again that some units are actually very happy to do that, and to force the commission to actually allow more patriotic voices inside the commission.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm going to take two last questions that I have here. There's a lot of great questions, but I'm going to boil it down to two last ones. So, Mike, I'm going to come to you. There was a question about now that the Abraham Accords, from Karim Qasim, now that the Abraham Accords have been signed, would that change the regional security scene in the GCC Arabian Peninsula? I know we're focused on the Levant, but I'm sure that the new the Abraham Accords may have some impact on the way both Israel and the Gulf perceive Iranian activity in the Levant. Can you shed some light on that? Das Rayburn, you're welcome to also chime in. I have a separate question for you after Mike's done. Go ahead, Mike.
The bottom line is yes. I think the Abraham Accords have the potential to have an impact on the regional security architecture. I believe that this is the intention of both Israel and its new Gulf peace partners. I think one of the reasons why the UAE and Bahrain move forward, and perhaps others will do, is but because they are concerned about what's happening in the regional stability, the Iranian ambitions in their own vicinity. The region has just experienced a decade of wars and turmoil, what began as a so-called Arab Spring. It's mostly dysfunctional. It's characterized by failed or failing states, and I think those countries look around and came to the conclusion that Israel is a capable partner, a potent partner that they can cooperate with. Now, the Israel-UAE Treaty of Peace in Article 7 speaks about both parties joining hands with the United States to design what is called a strategic agenda for the Middle East. Certainly from Israeli standpoint, the number one item on such a strategic agenda is Iran, cooperating with Iran, checking Iranian ambitions, both nuclear ambitions and regional ambitions. I know that regional actors have other concerns on their plate, Turkish ambitions, the Turkey-Qatar axis, Islamists and so on. But I think the number one agenda is definitely Iran, and expanding relations between Israel and Arabs opens more options to cope with the Iranian destabilizing activities in the region.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, we just have a couple more minutes. So Das Rayburn, if you want to address that. And also there were a couple of questions about possible tensions between Russia and Iran inside of Syria. And does that offer any openings for the United States and its allies to play, make any positive headway?
On the Abraham Accords, I think Mike described the regional dynamics pretty well. From the U.S. perspective, the United States is we're committed to helping the UAE meet its security requirements, and even now, U.S. officials are in discussions with the UAE about what the United States can do more to help the UAE better defend itself from potential attack from the Iranian regime. On the question of tensions inside Syria between Russia and the Iranian regime, they are there, and they are natural. They're to be expected. Because the Russians and the Iranian regime have conflicting aims and end states and visions for Syria. I think the Russians would like to see Syria return to the sort of pre-2011 normal and remain essentially, a regional partner of Russia, a regional client of Russia, and try to put back the same system kind of back together. The Iranians want to turn, or the Iranian regime, not the Iranian people, but the Iranian regime, I think, would like to turn Syria into a satrapy of the Iranian empire, and as I say, make it into a military garrison that the Quds Force can use against the region. And also, as Noir pointed out, the Iranian regime has this obsession with trying to change the demographics and societies where they have military interventions. They were doing that in Iraq for a long time. They've been doing that in Lebanon for a long time, and now in Syria, to go to a place that is a very cosmopolitan, multifaceted and secular society, highly educated society, and turn that into a sister Islamic republic of the Iranian regime is just kind of crazy. But that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to set up religious centers here and there, and as I mentioned before, trying to create militias that have to express loyalty to and adherence to Walayat al-Faqih. It's unthinkable. I know you, Jumana, from a Syrian background, you would recognize, to any Syrian, this is unthinkable that this would happen in Syria. This is the crazy, jarring, destabilizing kind of thing that the Iranian regime is trying to do. You can see that these two end states, then they're clashing. So it hasn't yet manifested itself in a breaking of the military alliance on the ground between the Iranian regime and Russia, but at that higher strategic state, they're going further and further apart. And I think that does represent opportunities for those of us who just want to see an end to the Syrian people suffering and an end to the conflict.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry to cut everyone off, and I'm sorry for all the questions that we didn't get to. And several of our panelists had a lot more to say and are very insightful, and I'm sorry we couldn't come back to you. But I really appreciated the opportunity to walk away with some really thoughtful commentary about the challenges of Iranian militias outside of Iran's borders and what impacts that has on both societies and, most importantly, the stability of governments in several countries in the region. And most importantly, about what both the current and a possible future democratic administration can and should do about it. Finally, I just want to invite everyone to read two pieces associated with this event, written both by Nawar and Hamdi on the Iranian militias. They'll both be on our Rafiq Hariri Center Minisource blog over the next couple of days. And thank you very much, and please have a wonderful rest of the day.